Shattered Secrets. Chapter 1. A Chance Encounter. Jay never imagined that the most important meeting of his life would happen on the very day he had completely lost faith in fate. The cafe he found himself in promised nothing special. Ordinary tables, ordinary people, an ideal place to blend into the background and try to forget that his life had just collapsed. Yet, the moment he stepped inside, Jay felt a strange sense that something significant was about to happen here, though he couldn't explain why. He sat down at a window table and ordered a double whiskey. The drink was supposed to offer him relief from the thoughts that buzzed around his head like a swarm of flies. 20 years of marriage had come down to a single court proceeding. 20 years that had once seemed like an eternity now felt like they had crumbled to dust. But just as he took his first sip, his attention was caught by a woman sitting in a distant corner. Shadows seemed to gather around her, as if her thoughts were darker and heavier than those of everyone else. She didn't notice him, lost in her own world. But it didn't matter. He couldn't take his eyes off her. The bartender, noticing Jay's interest, quietly approached and whispered, "Her name's Beth. She finalized her divorce today." Tough timing, right? Jay froze, trying to process what he had just heard. They were both here for the same reason, to escape their pain. But could their shared pain build a bridge between them? Something about this coincidence felt too meaningful to ignore. He felt a strange pull, as if something or someone was urging him to take a chance. Don't let this moment slip away, he thought, and made a decision. He got up and walked toward her table. "Excuse me, I don't mean to intrude, but I'm going through a divorce today, too," he said with a tentative smile. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with weariness and a cold determination. "So what?" she replied flatly, though there was a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Maybe nothing," Jay said softly. "But sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who's going through the same thing." Beth paused. She wanted to dismiss him, but something in his words struck a chord. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded slightly toward the empty chair. "Fine, sit down. Since we're both in the same boat, maybe there's something worth talking about." And so their conversation began. Two strangers sharing stories about their broken lives. With each word, they uncovered more and more of their shattered pasts. And the more they talked, the more they realized that this chance encounter was anything but coincidental. Chapter 2. Conversations and Confessions. The silence between them was almost palpable. Jay could feel his heart beating slightly faster than usual. It seemed that every word he might say could either shatter this fragile connection or solidify it. He didn't want to rush things, so he just sat there, waiting for Beth to speak first. Beth, on the other hand, continued to stir her coffee absent-mindedly. She was trying to collect her thoughts, but it was harder than she expected. Just a few hours ago, she had signed the final divorce papers, and now she felt empty, as if something inside her had broken. Finally, she raised her eyes to Jay. There was something in her gaze that made him freeze. It was the look of someone who had been through a lot, but hadn't lost the will to fight. "You said you're going through a divorce, too," she began slowly. "How did it happen?" Jay took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Linda and I were married for 20 years. It wasn't a perfect marriage, but I thought it was strong. We have 2 kids. Over the past few years, something changed, but I tried to ignore it. Then I started noticing little things, her frequent absences, late-night calls, changes in her behavior. It all seemed strange, but I didn't want to believe the worst." Beth nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She knew that feeling, the reluctance to see the truth until it hits you in the face. "One day, I decided to find out what was going on," Jay continued, his voice becoming quieter. "It felt strange, like I was breaking some kind of rule. I followed her. It was a strange feeling, like I was breaking some kind of unspoken rule. I found her at a cafe, not like this one. And she wasn't alone. She was sitting at a table with a woman, or so I thought at first. It turned out to be a man dressed as a woman. His name was Charlie. It was a shock, I won't lie. I realized that my wife had been living a double life, and at that moment, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I filed for divorce. Beth quietly exhaled. Jay's story reminded her of her own shattered marriage. "I can understand how you feel," she said softly. "My marriage seemed normal, too, until I found out the truth. Ray, he cheated on me with his secretary. She got pregnant, and he decided he wanted to be with her. I offered to adopt the child, but he didn't even consider it. That's when I knew it was over." For a moment, they both fell silent, absorbing what they had heard. It seemed that there were no winners in this conversation. Only two people who had lost their families and were now trying to pick up the pieces of their lives. "And what now?" Jay asked, breaking the silence. "Now," Beth repeated, with a slight, bitter smile. "Now we just try to move forward, like everyone else. But maybe this is our chance. A chance to start fresh." Jay nodded, feeling a faint spark of hope growing inside him. "Maybe," he replied quietly. "Maybe we should give it a try." From that moment, their conversation became something more than just an exchange of stories. It was the beginning of something new, a beginning neither Jay nor Beth could have anticipated. Chapter 3, Secrets of the Past Time, slipped away unnoticed in the cafe. Outside, dusk was already settling in, while their conversation, which had started with cautious words and fragmented memories, gradually grew more personal. It felt as though they were exchanging more than just words, pieces of their souls, attempting to rebuild their lives from the shards of the past. Jay felt a sense of relief as he finally opened up, sharing parts of his life that had been locked away for too long. Speaking about the past was painful, but it was also strangely therapeutic. "Have you ever wondered when it all went wrong?" Jay asked, absent-mindedly turning his glass in his hands. Beth pondered his question for a moment before answering. "Yes, I think about that often, but it seems like we can never pinpoint the exact moment. It's like a crack in the glass. Small at first, but it grows over time until everything shatters." Jay nodded, accepting her words as his own. "A crack in the glass," he repeated. "Yes, that's exactly how it felt. I think it started when Linda went back to work after a long break. At first, I was happy for her. She was full of energy, and her job brought her joy. But then she began staying late, saying she had too much work. I didn't pay attention, writing it off as job stress. But one day, our daughter, Becky, noticed that her mom was going out too often at night. She dressed up and left, saying she was meeting with friends we had never heard of. Beth listened intently, her face calm, but her eyes showed understanding. She had gone through something similar herself, and Jay felt he could speak freely with her. "One evening, I decided to find out what was going on," Jay continued, his voice growing quieter. "It felt wrong, like I was breaking some unspoken rule. I followed her to a cafe, not like this one, and saw her sitting at a table with a woman, or so I thought. But it turned out to be a man dressed as a woman. His name was Charlie. That was a shock, no doubt about it. Suddenly, everything made sense. The late nights, the changes in her behavior. Linda had been living a double life, and when I finally confronted her, she realized it was over. I made it clear I wouldn't tolerate it, and I filed for divorce." Beth exhaled softly. Jay's story resonated deeply with her own shattered marriage. "I can relate," she said quietly. "It's not just the cheating, it's the betrayal at the deepest level. It destroys not just your marriage, but your entire faith in people." Jay felt her words echo in his heart. He nodded in agreement, realizing that this meeting with Beth was becoming a lifeline for him. Perhaps they were both broken, but in their brokenness, they found common ground, the desire to rediscover themselves, even on the ruins of their past. "We're more than our losses," Jay finally said, his voice tinged with a new sense of confidence. "Maybe that's what we need to remember." Beth looked at him, and for the first time that evening, smiled sincerely. In that smile was an acknowledgement of their shared pain, but also a hope for something better ahead. Chapter 4. The Beginning of Change. When they left the cafe, night had fully descended upon the city. A light breeze rustled the last remnants of daylight, turning the streets into a cozy yet slightly eerie place, where the glow of streetlights softly reflected off the wet pavement. Jay and Beth walked side by side, unhurried, as if the invisible thread between them was growing stronger with each passing moment. Jay felt a strange lightness mixed with uncertainty. The conversation with Beth had awakened feelings in him that he thought were long buried, hope which he believed was lost. But with that hope came doubts. What happens next? Should he allow himself to dive into a new relationship when his old wounds had barely begun to heal? "What do you think the future holds for us?" Jay suddenly asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a trace of anxiety in it. He looked at Beth, hoping she shared his thoughts. Beth thought for a moment, her gaze fixed on the distant city lights. "I don't know," she said quietly. "For a long time, I was afraid to look ahead. After the divorce, it felt like the future was just a dark void, and I didn't know if I could ever find the strength to change anything. But now, maybe with you, I'm starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel." These words struck Jay deeply. He felt his heart beat a little faster. "I think so too," he admitted. "We've both been through hell. But maybe this is our chance to start over. We can leave the past behind and try to build something new, even if we don't know how yet." Beth smiled faintly, though there was still a shadow of doubt in her eyes. "But how do we begin? How do we stop being afraid to trust again? What if this is just temporary comfort?" Jay thought for a moment, and his answer was unexpectedly simple. "Maybe we should start small. Just allow ourselves to be happy, even if just for a moment. Don't worry about tomorrow, and focus on what we have now." Beth nodded slowly. "Small steps, right?" she said with a slight smile. "Maybe you're right. We've been scared for too long, and it's kept us from moving forward. We need to take a risk." They continued walking through the night, their steps in sync, and the conversation drifted from serious topics to lighter, almost fleeting ones. Beth spoke about how difficult it had been to adjust to living alone again, how she learned to enjoy the little things, new books she discovered, or the chance meetings with kind people. Jay, in turn, shared his fears about how his children would react to the divorce, and how hard it was for him to get used to the empty house. These conversations drew them closer, filling the evening with warmth. Jay realized that, perhaps for the first time in a long while, he had found someone who understood him without needing many words, someone who felt the same way. And this realization brought him the peace he had been missing. When they reached a street corner, Beth stopped and looked at Jay. "Thank you for tonight," she said, her voice sincere and warm. "I don't know what's coming next, but I'm glad we met." Jay smiled in return. "Me too. Let's stay in touch. Maybe we should try something new." Beth nodded slightly, and, after a moment of hesitation, took his hand. It was a light touch, but it carried the weight of their new connection. "Yes, let's try," she said softly. And for the first time in a long while, there was a genuine spark of hope in her eyes. They parted ways at the corner, but both knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a new journey, where the past would be left behind and something completely different, perhaps better, awaited them ahead. Chapter 5. The first encounter after divorce. A week had passed since the night Jay and Beth parted ways at the street corner. During that time, Jay replayed their conversations in his mind, trying to understand what it all meant for both of them. He wasn't sure what Beth was feeling, but he knew that something important had sparked between them, something that could change their lives. One evening, Jay decided to return to the cafe where it all began. It was a spontaneous decision, driven by some vague inner impulse. He wanted to sit there, just as he had that first night, and perhaps, by chance, run into Beth again, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was hoping for. When he walked in, it felt like time had turned back. The same dim lights, the same tables, but his heart skipped a beat when he saw her. Beth was sitting at the same table where they had first talked. But she wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man Jay didn't recognize. And there was something intense about their interaction. Jay froze in place, unsure of what to do. Should he approach them? Leave them be? His mind was flooded with questions. Who was this man? What was he doing here? And why did Beth look like she was on the verge of tears? He took a hesitant step forward, but just then, the man abruptly stood up and grabbed Beth's arm. She tried to pull away, but he held her tightly, leaning in to whisper something into her ear. Jay saw the color drain from Beth's face, and she became still, as if paralyzed by fear. Unable to stand by any longer, Jay quickly made his way to their table. "Is everything all right?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though inside he was boiling with anger. The man turned to him, and Jay caught a glimpse of something menacing in his eyes. "This is none of your business, pal," the man snapped, but there was an undercurrent of threat in his voice. "Let her go," Jay said firmly, his body tensing as he prepared for a confrontation. Beth looked up at Jay, and he saw desperation in her eyes. This is my ex-husband, Ray," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jay felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This was the Ray who had destroyed Beth's life. And now, he was back. "You heard her. Let go." Jay stepped forward, but Ray didn't budge, still gripping Beth's arm. The tension in the air was palpable, like a bomb about to go off. "She doesn't know what she wants," Ray sneered, though his voice was filled with fury. "You think she's told you everything. You think you know the truth." Beth tried to say something, but Ray yanked her closer, making her gasp in pain. Without thinking, Jay grabbed Ray's shoulder and shoved him away from Beth. "I said, let her go." Within seconds, Ray lashed out, punching Jay in the chest and sending him stumbling backward. The cafe fell into a tense silence as patrons froze in shock, unable to believe what was happening. But Jay couldn't stop now. He lunged at Ray again, and the two men grappled fiercely, knocking over tables and chairs as they struggled on the floor. Suddenly, Beth screamed, "Stop!" It wasn't just a cry. It was a wail of despair. Jay froze, and Ray took the opportunity to break free and scramble to his feet. He shot a venomous look at Beth and snarled, "You'll regret leaving me." He stormed out of the cafe, but before he left, Ray turned to Jay with an icy glare and whispered, "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll be back." As soon as Ray disappeared, a heavy silence fell over the cafe. Beth was trembling, her face pale, and her eyes wide with fear. Jay rushed to her side, trying to calm her down. "Are you okay?" he asked. But she could only nod, too shaken to speak. What did he mean? What was he talking about? Jay felt like there was something she wasn't telling him, but Beth avoided his gaze. "Jay, I should have told you earlier," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "There's something you don't know about Ray. He wasn't just unfaithful. He's dangerous. And now he's back." Those words hit Jay like a ton of bricks. Suddenly, he realized that their problems were far from over. Ray wasn't just a bitter ex. He was a threat they had underestimated. And now Jay knew that their meeting which had seemed like the beginning of something new, might actually be the start of something far darker and more dangerous. Chapter 6: Shadows of the Past. Several days had passed since the incident at the cafe, but the tension in the air refused to dissipate. Jay felt a constant unease, as if something ominous was looming on the horizon. Beth had been distant ever since, avoiding his calls and messages with short, curt replies. He knew she was hiding something, but he was afraid to push her too hard. That night, Jay sat alone in his living room, trying to distract himself with a book, but thoughts of Beth and Ray kept invading his mind. What was Ray up to? What was Beth not telling him? The questions gnawed at him, making it impossible to focus. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the table, and the screen lit up with an incoming call. It was Beth. Jay. Her voice was filled with anxiety, and he could tell she was holding back tears. "I need to see you. Right now. It's urgent." "Of course," Jay replied immediately, feeling a rush of concern. "What's going on? I can't talk over the phone. Just come over. I'll explain everything when you get here." And with that, she hung up, leaving him no time to ask more questions. Jay jumped to his feet, grabbed his keys, and rushed out the door. The drive to Beth's house felt like it took an eternity. The city lights blurred as he sped through the streets, his mind racing with possibilities. What could be so urgent? What had Ray done now? When he arrived at her house, everything was eerily quiet, too quiet. The lights were off, and something about the stillness unsettled him. Jay got out of his car and approached the front door. He knocked, but there was no answer. His heart pounded in his chest as he knocked again, louder this time. After a moment, the door creaked open, and Jay saw Beth standing in the doorway. She looked terrified, like a cornered animal. "Come in, quickly," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. As soon as Jay stepped inside, Beth slammed the door shut and locked it. The silence in the house was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their breathing. "Beth, what's going on?" "You're scaring me," Jay said, trying to remain calm. Beth began to speak quickly, almost frantically, as if she feared she might not get the chance to finish. "Ray, he's been watching me. I've seen him several times over the past few days. He's been near my house, at my work, and I'm sure he's planning something." Jay felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What do you mean he's been watching you? You said he's dangerous, but you didn't tell me how. What aren't you saying, Beth?" Beth took a shaky breath and ran a hand through her hair, as if trying to wipe away the fear that clung to her. "Ray, he's not just a cheater. He's involved with some very bad people. I didn't tell you because I was scared. During our marriage, he got mixed up in something I only found out about too late. There were shady deals, blackmail, threats. I tried to leave him, but he warned me that if I told anyone or filed for divorce, he'd destroy me. I thought the divorce would be the end of it, but he hasn't let go." Jay felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This was worse than he'd imagined. "And now you think he's trying to drag you back into whatever he was involved in?" Beth nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what he wants, but he made it clear he's not done with me. I'm scared, Jay. I don't know what to do." Before Jay could respond, a sudden crash shattered the window in the living room. Glass exploded into the room, and a small, cylindrical object rolled across the floor before erupting in a thick cloud of smoke. The room filled with dense, choking fumes, and Jay's lungs burned as he struggled to breathe. "Beth, get down," he yelled, reaching out to her through the blinding smoke. They both dropped to the floor, covering their faces. But within seconds, the front door was kicked open with a loud bang, and two masked men stormed into the house. Jay felt strong hands grab him and slam him to the ground, pinning him down. Everything was happening too fast. He heard Beth scream, but the sound was abruptly cut off. One of the men pressed a gun to Jay's head, and he froze, his heart pounding in his ears. "Don't move," the man hissed. You made a big mistake getting involved. Ray sent us a message, and it's clear. Stay out of this if you want to stay alive." Jay's mind raced. Ray had orchestrated this. This wasn't just about scaring them. This was a message, a deadly one. But before he could think any further, the front door burst open again, and a loud voice shouted, "Freeze! Police!" Chaos erupted as the men who had attacked them were suddenly surrounded by armed officers. The room filled with shouts and the clatter of weapons as the intruders were quickly subdued. One of the officers pulled the man off Jay and cuffed him, while another rushed to help Beth, who was lying on the floor, trembling. Jay couldn't believe what was happening. The situation had turned on its head in a matter of seconds. One of the officers helped him to his feet, and that's when Jay saw him, Tom, standing in the doorway, gun drawn, his face stern. "I knew Ray would make his move," Tom said, holstering his weapon. "We've been monitoring him closely ever since you told me about the cafe incident. When he started targeting Beth, we knew it was only a matter of time before he struck." Jay was in shock, struggling to process everything. "You knew this would happen? You were watching us?" Tom nodded. "I couldn't take any chances. Ray's been on our radar for a while, but he's always slipped through our fingers. Tonight, we finally have enough to take him down for good." Jay felt a rush of relief, but also a lingering sense of dread. "So it's over? For now," Tom said, his tone serious. "But Ray's not the type to give up easily. Even behind bars, he could still be a threat. We'll keep an eye on him, but you need to stay vigilant." As the police escorted the intruders out of the house, Jay and Beth held each other close, trying to absorb the shock of what had just happened. The nightmare had been real, but they had survived. Barely. But deep down, Jay knew that this was not the end. Ray was still out there, somewhere, waiting. And though they had narrowly escaped this time, the shadow of danger still loomed over them. Jay understood now that the fight was far from over. But as he looked into Beth's eyes, he also knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Chapter 7. No Way Out. The days that followed were filled with unease. Despite the police intervention and Ray's capture, Jay couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. Beth was a shell of her former self, constantly looking over her shoulder, her anxiety palpable in every conversation. The threat had been neutralized, but the fear remained. One evening, Jay received an unexpected call from Tom. His voice was calm, but there was an urgency beneath it that Jay couldn't ignore. "Jay, we need to meet. There's something you need to know. It's important." Jay's heart skipped a beat. "Is it about Ray? What's going on?" "Just meet me at the old warehouse by the docks in an hour. I'll explain everything then," Tom said before abruptly hanging up. Jay's mind raced as he drove to the warehouse. What could be so urgent that Tom couldn't say it over the phone? The night was dark and cold, a stark contrast to the dread building inside him. The warehouse was an isolated, abandoned structure, far from the prying eyes of the city. As he pulled up, Jay saw Tom's car parked near the entrance, but the area was otherwise deserted. Tom was waiting inside, his expression grim. "Thanks for coming, Jay. I know this place isn't exactly inviting, but I didn't want to risk anyone overhearing us." Jay nodded, trying to read Tom's face. "What's this about? Is there something you didn't tell me?" Tom took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. "It's about Ray. I told you we caught him, but the truth is, he never made it to the police station. The convoy transporting him was attacked." Jay's stomach dropped. "Attacked? What do you mean?" "Ray's associates. They ambushed the transport, killed the officers, and took Ray. He's out there, Jay, and he's more dangerous than ever. He's coming for you and Beth, and he won't stop until he gets what he wants." Jay felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. "Why are you just telling me this now? We should have been warned." Tom looked away, guilt flickering across his face. "I was trying to protect you, buy you some time to get out, but it's too late for that now. They're closer than you think." Suddenly, the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the empty warehouse. Jay's instincts kicked in. "Tom, what did you do?" Before Tom could answer, several men emerged from the shadows, armed and ready. Jay recognized the look in their eyes, merciless and cold. These were professionals, and they weren't here for negotiations. "I'm sorry, Jay," Tom said quietly, his voice trembling. "Ray made a deal with them. They promised me protection, but only if I delivered you." Jay's blood ran cold. Betrayal. The man he had trusted had led him straight into a trap. "You sold us out, Tom?" After everything, Tom's face contorted with regret. "I didn't have a choice. You don't know what they're capable of. What Ray is capable of." Jay's mind raced. He had to think fast. There was no way out, no escape in sight. The men were closing in, weapons drawn, ready to end it all. But Jay wasn't going down without a fight. He looked around, searching for anything he could use to defend himself. But the warehouse offered little in the way of protection. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a sudden explosion shook the building. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. The men shouted in confusion, their carefully orchestrated ambush thrown into chaos. In the darkness, Jay felt a hand grab his arm. He spun around, ready to fight, but stopped when he saw who it was. Beth. Her face was lit only by the faint glow of the fires now burning in the distance, but her eyes were fierce, determined. "Come on, we need to go, now," she whispered urgently. Jay didn't hesitate. They bolted toward the nearest exit, weaving through the chaos. The sounds of gunfire and shouting filled the air as they sprinted through the darkened corridors. Whoever had set off the explosion had given them a chance, a slim one, but it was enough. They burst out of the warehouse and into the cold night air, their breath visible in the frigid temperatures. Jay's heart pounded in his chest as they ran toward the car. He could hear footsteps behind them, the echo of their pursuers growing louder with each passing second. They reached the car, and Jay fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. He finally got the door open, and they both scrambled inside. Just as he turned the ignition, a bullet shattered the rear window. "Go, Jay, go!" Beth screamed, and he floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as they sped away. The car tore down the empty streets, the roar of the engine mingling with the adrenaline coursing through their veins. Jay glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the silhouettes of the men fading into the distance. For now, they were safe, but they both knew it was only temporary. As they drove into the night, Jay's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. They had narrowly escaped death, but what now? Ray was out there, and Tom's betrayal had left them vulnerable. They were running, but to where? There was no longer any certainty, only the knowledge that the danger was closer than ever. Beth broke the silence. "Jay, we can't keep running. We need to end this." Jay knew she was right, but the question lingered. How? How could they stop a man as ruthless and relentless as Ray, especially now that they had no one left to trust? But one thing was clear. There was no turning back. They were in too deep, and the only way out was through the fire. Jay tightened his grip on the steering wheel, determination hardening in his eyes. "We'll end this," he said, his voice low and resolved. "One way or another, we'll end this." Chapter 8. The Final Stand. The car sped through the dark streets, headlights cutting through the misty night. Jay's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Beside him, Beth sat in silence, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard. They both knew the gravity of their situation. There was no more running, no more hiding. This was it, the end game. Jay's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. Ray was out there, hunting them, and Tom's betrayal had left them with few options. But they had one advantage left. Ray didn't know where they were headed. Jay had a place in mind, a location he hadn't mentioned to anyone, not even Tom. It was the last place anyone would think to look. And that's exactly why it might work. "We're going to my father's cabin," Jay finally said, breaking the silence. "It's deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. No one knows about it. We can regroup there. Figure out our next move." Beth nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Do you think Ray will find us there?" Jay shook his head. "Not if we're careful. We'll lay low, stay off the grid, but we need to be ready. If he comes, we'll have to fight." They drove in silence for hours, leaving the city far behind. The road twisted and turned as they ascended into the mountains, the trees growing denser with each passing mile. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. It felt like they were driving into another world, one where the rules of civilization no longer applied. Finally, they reached the cabin, a small, secluded structure, nestled deep in the woods. The place was old but sturdy, built by Jay's father decades ago. It had been years since Jay had last visited, but the cabin was still in good shape. As they pulled up to the cabin, the engine's hum died, leaving them enveloped in an eerie silence. No streetlights, no distant hum of the city, just the rustling of leaves and the whisper of the wind. Jay and Beth quickly unloaded the car, bringing in supplies, flashlights, and the few weapons they had managed to gather. The cabin was simple, with a single large room, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. Jay checked the windows and doors, making sure they were secure. Beth lit a fire, its warmth doing little to dispel the cold dread that hung in the air. "We have a few hours before dawn," Jay said, glancing at his watch. "Get some rest. I'll keep watch." Beth looked at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "What if he finds us?" Jay met her gaze. "If he does, we'll be ready." But deep down, Jay knew that readiness might not be enough. Ray had already proven he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And with the resources at his disposal, it was only a matter of time before he tracked them down. Jay had no illusions about the fight ahead. It would be brutal, and only one side would walk away. Beth lay down on the old couch, pulling a blanket over herself. Despite her exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. She kept her eyes on the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows that danced across the walls. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that danger lurked just beyond the trees. Jay sat by the window, his eyes scanning the dark forest outside. He couldn't see much beyond the tree line, but his ears were attuned to every sound. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made his heart race. His mind was sharp, alert, refusing to let fatigue take hold. This was the moment he had feared for days, the calm before the storm. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. But then, just as dawn was beginning to break, Jay heard it. A faint, distant noise. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but then it came again, louder this time. The unmistakable sound of an engine, faint, but growing closer. Jay's blood ran cold. He quickly moved to Beth's side, shaking her awake. "Beth, get up. They're here." She bolted upright, fear flashing in her eyes. "What do we do?" "Get to the back room," Jay said urgently. "There's a trapdoor under the floorboards that leads to the cellar. Hide there. I'll hold them off as long as I can." "No," Beth protested. "I'm not leaving you alone." Jay grabbed her shoulders, his voice firm. "Beth, if they get past me, you're our last chance. Please do this for me." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she nodded, knowing he was right. She ran to the back room, quickly locating the trapdoor and disappearing into the cellar below. Jay watched her go, then turned back to the front door, his heart pounding. He grabbed the shotgun from the table and loaded it with trembling hands. This was it, the moment of truth. The engine noise grew louder, closer. Jay could hear the crunch of gravel as the vehicle approached the cabin. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, the sound of car doors slamming shut echoed through the trees. Jay positioned himself behind an overturned table, aiming the shotgun at the door. His finger hovered over the trigger, every muscle in his body tense. He heard footsteps on the porch, the creak of old wood under heavy boots. Then, the doorknob turned slowly, almost mockingly, as if daring him to act. The door swung open with a crash, and Ray stepped inside, flanked by two of his men. His eyes were cold, murderous. He scanned the room, quickly spotting Jay crouched behind the table. A cruel smile spread across his face. "So here you are, Jay," Ray sneered. "I have to admit, you've been a real thorn in my side. But it's over now. There's no one left to help you." Jay didn't respond. He kept his aim steady, waiting for the right moment. Ray took a step forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his side. "You should have stayed out of this," Ray continued. "Beth was mine. She still is. And now, you're going to pay for getting in my way." Ray's men fanned out, moving to flank Jay. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, but he couldn't back down now. This was the last stand. "Not today," Jay muttered under his breath, and then he squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared, the blast ripping through the air. One of Ray's men went down, blood splattering across the cabin floor. The second man returned fire, bullets thudding into the walls as Jay dove for cover. He rolled to the side, grabbing a pistol from his belt and firing back, hitting the second man square in the chest. Ray, undeterred, drew his own gun and fired, the bullet grazing Jay's shoulder. Jay gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing to let it slow him down. He had to end this, once and for all. The two men circled each other, weapons drawn, eyes locked in a deadly stare. The cabin was silent, except for their heavy breathing, the air thick with tension. "This is for Beth," Jay growled, and he lunged forward, firing his pistol. The shot hit Ray in the leg, sending him crashing to the ground. Ray screamed in pain, dropping his gun as he clutched his bleeding leg. Jay stood over him, breathing hard, his gun trained on Ray's head. "It's over, Ray. You're done." But Ray's lips twisted into a sneer, even through the pain. "You think this changes anything? You can kill me, but there are more like me. You'll never be free." Jay hesitated for a moment, the weight of Ray's words sinking in. Could it really be over? Or would this nightmare continue, with new enemies rising up to take Ray's place? Before he could decide, the door to the cellar burst open, and Beth emerged, holding a gun of her own. She looked at Jay, then at Ray, lying helpless on the floor. "No, Jay," she said softly, her voice steady. "It ends here." With that, she pulled the trigger, and Ray's body went limp, his eyes wide with shock. The room fell silent, the finality of the moment hanging in the air. Jay lowered his gun, his hands trembling as the adrenaline drained from his body. Beth dropped her weapon, rushing to Jay's side. They held each other tightly, the enormity of what they had just done settling in. "It's over," Beth whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's finally over." Jay nodded, unable to speak. He knew they had won, but the cost had been high. They had been pushed to their limits, forced to fight for their very lives. But now, at last, the nightmare was over. As they stood in the quiet cabin, holding each other close, the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees. It was a new dawn, a new beginning. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Jay and Beth knew they would face it together, stronger than ever before. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. The morning light that filtered through the cabin windows felt surreal, almost dreamlike. Jay and Beth stood side by side, staring at the lifeless body of Ray, who had been their tormentor for so long. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the occasional crackle of the dying fire. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the weight of what they had just done. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They were both still processing the events that had unfolded just hours earlier. The terror, the violence, the finality of it all. It was overwhelming. Jay could feel the adrenaline slowly draining from his body, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. Beth finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. "We really did it. He's gone." Jay nodded, his gaze fixed on Ray's motionless form. "Yes, it's over. But what now?" That question hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. They had survived, but at what cost? They had crossed a line, taken a life, and nothing would ever be the same. The reality of their situation began to sink in. They had won the battle, but they had also lost a part of themselves in the process. Beth wiped away a tear, her hand still shaking. "We can't stay here. We need to leave before anyone finds out," Jay agreed. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a prison, a tomb for the darkness they had confronted. "We'll pack up and go. We'll disappear, just like we planned before. But this time, for good." They moved quickly, gathering their belongings and wiping away any traces of the fight. The cabin had served its purpose, but now it was just a reminder of everything they wanted to leave behind. Jay loaded their bags into the car while Beth carefully cleaned the weapons they had used, making sure no evidence remained. As they worked, Jay couldn't help but think about what lay ahead. Disappearing wouldn't be easy. They would have to sever all ties, abandon their lives, and start fresh somewhere far away. It was a daunting thought, but it was the only way to ensure their safety. When they were ready to leave, Beth paused at the doorway, looking back at the cabin one last time. "I never wanted it to end like this," she whispered. Jay placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Neither did I, but we did what we had to do. Now, we have to live with it." They got into the car, and as Jay turned the key in the ignition, the engine roared to life, breaking the silence. They drove away from the cabin, leaving behind the twisted memories of the past few days. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but it was the only path they had left. For hours, they drove in silence, the tension between them gradually easing as the miles passed. The scenery changed from dense forests to open fields, then to small towns and winding highways. With each passing mile, the weight of their ordeal began to lift, replaced by a cautious hope for the future. But as they crossed state lines and put more distance between themselves and the life they once knew, Jay couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. Ray was dead, but the darkness he had brought into their lives lingered, like a shadow that refused to disappear. As night fell, they pulled into a small, anonymous motel on the outskirts of a quiet town. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, a haven for those looking to disappear. Jay booked a room, paying in cash, and they settled in for the night, exhausted from the day's events. Beth collapsed onto the bed, her eyes heavy with fatigue. "Do you think we'll ever be able to forget this, to move on?" Jay sat beside her, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know. I hope so. But I think it's something we'll carry with us forever. We'll have to learn to live with it." Beth nodded, her eyes closing as sleep finally overtook her. Jay watched her for a moment, then got up and walked to the window. He pulled back the curtain slightly, peering out into the darkness. The parking lot was empty, the night still and quiet. But Jay couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been with him since they left the cabin. And then, in the stillness of the night, Jay's phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat. Who could be calling them now? Carefully, he picked up the phone and answered, his voice tense. "Hello?" A cold, familiar voice replied, sending chills down his spine. "You thought it was over, Jay? You thought killing Ray would solve everything? Jay's blood ran cold. Who is this? The voice laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. Let's just say I was a business partner of Ray's. And now, thanks to you, I have some unfinished business to take care of. You and Beth may have won this round, but the game is far from over. Jay felt the walls closing in around him. What do you want? The voice paused for a moment, then spoke with chilling finality. You took something from me, Jay. Now I'm going to take everything from you. Sleep well tonight. It'll be your last peaceful night for a long time. The line went dead, leaving Jay standing there in stunned silence, the phone still pressed to his ear. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Jay turned to look at Beth, who was sleeping soundly, unaware of the storm that was about to break over their heads. He knew he couldn't tell her, not yet. She needed to rest, to regain her strength. But deep down, Jay knew that this was just the beginning of a new fight, one that would push them both to their limits once again. As he stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, Jay made a silent vow. He would protect Beth at all costs. No matter what it took, no matter who came after them, he wouldn't let anyone take away the future they had fought so hard for. But as the shadows crept closer, Jay realized that they were facing something far more dangerous than Ray, a force that wouldn't stop until it had consumed everything in its path. And this time, there was no running, no hiding. This time, they would have to confront the darkness head-on or be swallowed by it completely. Chapter 10. The Final Battle. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting soft light on Beth as she slept peacefully. Jay, however, hadn't closed his eyes all night. The call he had received echoed in his mind, each word replaying like a haunting refrain. The fight was far from over, and the enemy they now faced was even more dangerous than Ray had ever been. Jay knew he couldn't keep this from Beth any longer. As soon as she stirred, he gently woke her, his face grave. "Beth, we need to talk." Beth rubbed her eyes and sat up, immediately sensing the tension. "What's wrong, Jay? Did something happen?" Jay took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "I got a call last night from someone who was working with Ray. They know what we did, and they're coming for us. They won't stop until they've taken everything." Beth's face paled as the gravity of his words sank in. "But I thought it was over. We finished it." Jay shook his head, his voice low. "I thought so too. But this is something bigger. Ray was just a piece of the puzzle. Now we're up against something much darker." Beth's eyes filled with fear, but also with a growing resolve. "What do we do, Jay? We can't keep running forever." Jay met her gaze, his expression hardening. "We don't run. We fight. We take the battle to them. End this once and for all." "But how?" Beth asked, her voice trembling. "We don't even know who they are." Jay stood up, pacing the room as he thought. "We might not know their names, but they know ours. That gives us an edge. They'll underestimate us, think we're just scared and desperate. We'll use that against them." Beth nodded, her fear giving way to determination. "What's the plan?" Jay stopped pacing and looked at her, his mind racing. "We set a trap. We'll make them think we're on the run, that we're vulnerable. But when they come for us, we'll be ready." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Jay and Beth worked tirelessly, planning every detail of their counterattack. They used burner phones to send misleading messages, leaving a trail that suggested they were fleeing to a remote location. In reality, they were setting up an ambush at an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, an isolated, forgotten place where no one would hear the chaos that was about to unfold. The night of the final confrontation arrived. The factory was a decaying ruin, its walls crumbling and covered in graffiti. The air was thick with the scent of rust and dampness. Jay and Beth had positioned themselves in the shadows, waiting for their pursuers to arrive. They had rigged the building with traps, hidden tripwires, explosives, and strategically placed weapons. Every corner was a potential death trap. Beth crouched beside Jay, her heart pounding in her chest. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. Jay squeezed her hand, offering what little comfort he could. "We don't have a choice. It's the only way to end this." Minutes ticked by like hours, the silence oppressive. Then, at last, the sound of engines echoed through the night. Headlights pierced the darkness as several black SUVs pulled up outside the factory. The doors opened, and a group of men,